Welcome to 1189, an online Bible commentary. My name is Tyler Marston, and today we're taking a look at Mark chapter 7. Jesus has continued his healing and preaching ministries as he's traveling around Galilee, and it's mostly been to Jews. But as we see his message spreading, we also see him rubbing up against the other religious movements of first century Israel. We've already seen some disagreements with the religious Pharisees and their hyper-literal interpretations of the Old Testament law. In this chapter, we'll see more of that, and we'll have a juxtaposition between the self-righteous Pharisees and the Gentiles. While they're presumably pretty ignorant of God and his Old Testament commands, we see that even these Gentiles realize that Jesus is someone special, someone who can heal them. And we get a portrait of Jesus not just as Israel's Messiah, but the Messiah for the whole world. The Pharisees and some of the scribes gathered around him when they had come from Jerusalem, and had seen that some of his disciples were eating their bread with impure hands, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they carefully wash their hands, thus observing the traditions of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they cleanse themselves. And there are many other things which they have received in order to observe, such as the washing of cups and pitchers and copper pots. Mark gives a pretty lengthy aside to show the difference between these followers of Jesus and the followers of the Pharisees. Mark is writing this gospel a few decades after Jesus' death and resurrection, after Gentiles have been incorporated into the church. He gives this background info on the Pharisees to fill in cultural gaps that would have existed even back then in the first century. Of course, this ends up giving us insight too, as followers of Jesus who are on a different continent 2 millennia later. Now, these washings before meals that Mark is describing did serve a hygienic purpose practically, but they were also done with ritualistic and ceremonial intention. And also notice that the Pharisees are not following laws in the Old Testament, but traditions from the elders. Most likely, according to New Testament scholar N.T. Wright, these traditions required every Pharisee to do these washing ceremonies like the ones described in Leviticus 14 and 15, but those were only prescribed for sick people. The Pharisees were making everyone do these washing ceremonies all the time in an effort to be even more clean and even more pure. Renaissance-era Hebrew scholar Johannes Buxtorf even recalled the story of Rabbi Akiva choosing to rather die of starvation in prison than eat his meals without proper washings. So obviously these washings were important to the Pharisees, which is why they were bewildered that Jesus' followers didn't do them. The Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat their bread with impure hands?" And he said to them, "Rightly did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far away from me. But in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men. Neglecting the commandment of God, you hold to the tradition of men.'" In defense of his disciples, Jesus cites Isaiah 29, accusing the Pharisees of offering lip service to God, but not giving him their hearts. They have supreme loyalty to their cultural traditions, but they don't actually follow God or his commandments at all. They'll make sure they do all these washings right, and make sure they offer all these sacrifices right, but they don't love their neighbor. They're not giving to the poor. Sound anything like churches today? He was also saying to them, "You are experts at setting aside the commandment of God in order to keep your tradition. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and your mother, and he who speaks evil of father or mother is to be put to death.' But you say, 'If a man says to his father or mother, whatever I have that would help you is Corban,' that is to say, given to God, you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or his mother, thus invalidating the word of God by your tradition which you have handed down. And you do many such things as that." Jesus goes on to give another example of the Pharisees claiming to follow God without actually doing what he's commanded. He rejects the Pharisaic teaching that people are absolved from taking care of their parents as long as they take the money they would have used to help them and give it as an offering instead. Mark transliterates the Hebrew word for offering, korban, which is used in places like Leviticus 1 specifically to refer to the offerings that support the tabernacle and temple sacrificial system. Jesus says that this teaching is in direct contradiction to the call to honor one's parents, found in the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20, and then reinforced in Exodus 21. Jesus is rebuking the Pharisees for their false holiness, trying to appear so righteous in the eyes of the people by giving all this money and neglecting your own family. After he called the crowd to him again, he began saying to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside the man which can defile him if it goes into him, but the things which proceed out of the man are what defile the man." When he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples questioned him about the parable, and he said to them, "Are you lacking in understanding also? Do you not understand that whatever goes into the man from outside cannot defile him? Because it does not go into his heart, but into his stomach, and is eliminated." Thus he declared all foods clean. After offering a cryptic parable on this subject, Jesus explains further with his disciples. The things that go into a man, whether it's unclean food or food eaten with unclean hands, those things don't defile anyone. It doesn't make anyone inherently sinful. The instructions regarding cleanliness were put in place to remind people to be holy and pure physically, spiritually, and emotionally. But they weren't real righteousness in and of themselves. And Mark clarifies in this moment that Jesus is citing on an issue that would go on to create much division in the early church. We see in Romans 14 that many early Christians had strong convictions one way or the other about eating or not eating unclean food. And that usually coincided with ethnic boundaries between Jewish and Gentile believers. Meanwhile, Acts 10 presents Peter's revelation from God that all foods are made clean. And this is used as an invitation to Gentiles who believe in Jesus to become part of the church. All of that to say that the point that Jesus is making here is that keeping or not keeping Jewish cultural traditions doesn't make anyone more or less righteous in the eyes of God. But, on the other hand, and he was saying, that which proceeds out of the man, that is what defiles the man. For from within, out of the hearts of men, proceed the evil thoughts, fornications, thefts, murders, adulteries, deeds of coveting and wickedness, as well as deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. All these evil things proceed from within and defile the man. As opposed to cultural traditions, the things that go into the man, Jesus says it's the things that come out of the man, his thoughts, his words, his actions. Those are what really show unrighteousness. He gives a list of sins and say that they all spring from some sort of perverted desire. The things that are in a person's heart, how he thinks, how he feels, and how that manifests into a person's actions, that is what marks people as righteous or unrighteous in the eyes of God. Now, unfortunately, we know that since the flood in Genesis 8, the human heart has always been evil since its youth. We all feel those desires towards power and ambition, sex, money, and murder. Hence why Old Testament authors like Ezekiel in chapter 36 longed for a day where God would give his people a new heart. One that Jeremiah in chapter 31 would say has God's law written onto it. We need to be completely transformed into people who desire things that God desires. We need to be transformed into images of God. That is what Jesus is here to do. Jesus got up and went away from there to the region of Tyre. And when he had entered a house, he wanted no one to know of it, yet he could not escape notice. But after hearing of him, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately came and fell at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of the Syro-Phoenician race, and she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he was saying to her, "Let the children be satisfied first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." In response to all of this, we hear about Jesus traveling north into Gentile Tyre, beyond the traditional boundaries of the historic Jewish nation. Despite Jesus' best efforts towards anonymity, a woman still recognizes him and begs for healing for her daughter. Jesus first gives the woman a test to see if she really has faith in him as the Messiah, not just as a traveling healer. Granted, the test is poorly translated. The word used here is not kuon, the Greek word for dog. It's the word kunarion, with a diminutive form added on, meaning it would probably be better translated as something like puppies or doggies. Jesus is asking the woman if God's healing should go to his children, presumably the Israelites, before the Gentiles. But she answered and said to him, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs." And he said to her, "Because of this answer, go, the demon has gone out of your daughter." And going back to her home, she found the child lying on the bed, the demon having left. And so the Syro-Phoenician woman ends up having faith. She wants healing from Jesus that the Israelites have refused to take. She has much more faith than the Jewish Pharisees, who were so committed to their cultural traditions that they missed the fulfillment of their scriptures. But for those who humbly recognize their desperate need for Jesus, there is forgiveness and healing and restoration. And that's whether they're Jewish or Syro-Phoenician or American. Again, he went out from the region of Tyre and came through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee, within the region of Decapolis. They brought to him one who was deaf and spoke with difficulty, and they implored him to lay his hand on him. Jesus took him aside from the crowd by himself and put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, he touched his tongue with the saliva, and looking up to heaven with a deep sigh, he said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "be opened." And his ears were opened, and the impediment of his tongue was removed, and he began speaking plainly. And he gave them orders not to tell anyone, but the more he ordered them, the more widely they continued to proclaim it. They were utterly astonished, saying, "He has done all things well. He makes even the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." This chapter ends with a miraculous healing that once again baffles the crowd. Jesus heals a man who is deaf and mute. And once again, Jesus instructs the crowd to keep quiet about what they've seen. And yet again, those warnings fall on deaf, or really newly not deaf, ears. The people are simply astonished at what they've seen, and so they can't keep it to themselves. Obviously, Jesus is doing something, bringing something that has never been seen before in this world of first century Judaism. This turns off many of the Pharisees, dedicated as they are to the cultural, traditional aspects of God's law. Their fatal flaw is that they want people to become like them, but they don't want to change themselves to align with God's purposes. And that's not unlike some church people today. Meanwhile, for those who realize their desperate need for Jesus, like the Syro-Phoenician woman and the mute man, Jesus has nothing but open arms and healing and forgiveness for them. Will we humble ourselves and repent to the same degree today? Thanks for watching 1189. I hope that you have a good day, and God bless.